My eyes scoured the perimeter. I detected no imminent threats. Even though the coast seemed clear, I knew a peril could be lurking from any corner of the reception hall and even from the outside of the Imperial Palace. Part of me would welcome the danger if changelings were to plunge in the room. For instance, I could show everypony what years of rigorous training built me into. However, the invasion was statistically unlikely to occur at that very moment, and the imminent safety of everypony took priority over my own life aspirations. It was my very ambitions thinking that had prevented me from taking part in the defense of Canterlot from the changelings. Potential dangers of dynamic events in unsecured environments had led me to volunteer for a temporary duty of guarding Prince Blueblood on one of his shopping sprees in Manhattan. It still haunted me that I had been stationed away from Canterlot on the one day the changelings did attack, and the royal guards were actually needed. I could have helped. This mental distraction was uncalled for, so I cut off that subconsciously induced thread of thought. I had a job to do, and regrets weren't contributing to the quality of my work. Remembering the words of wisdom that my grandpa used to say calmed me down. For each guard at least one opportunity presents itself during his career. Being ready for it at all times is what separates heroic guards from the rest. He brought up this line every time an opportunity for it would present itself. Sometimes he just said it out of the blue. It seemed like forever since I last heard his advice, as the kidney failure ended him years ago, but the message stayed engraved in my brain. I knew it was important. He wouldn't have said it that many times if it wasn't. It was relevant to the situation I was in. I just had to stay vigilant, and the opportunity would present itself without me seeking it. I would then just have to resolve it to the best of my abilities. With diligent training and my unwavering determination, I knew that I was prepared. I was capable of playing out future scenarios for all contingencies at all times, predicting most of the threats before they would happen. I focused on another ambassador that was waiting in the front of the line to greet Celeste. He was from Saudi Arabia, but I hadn't seen him before. His profile analysis wasn't in any of the files in my collection. Even though he noted on the list of invited guests, he was still the suspect in my eyes. The scale of my situation reminded me of my grandpa's story about his life's opportunity, and how he had took advantage of it to become a hero. An ambassador came into the ballroom to receive a formal greeting from Celeste, without brushing up on the protocols of our land. He approached, not to give Celeste a bow, but to give her an actual hug, as it was customary in his homeland. My granddad had known of their huggy nature and found the first-timer gift suspicious the moment he laid eyes on him. He analyzed the ambassador's body language and spotted his eyes connecting with Celeste's eyes, instead of angling down to the floor. Muscles in the ambassador's forelegs were tightened, instead of relaxed. Just as the guest was about to reach out with his forelegs and breach Celeste's comfort zone, my grandpa stepped forward, placing his weapon on the ambassador's path. He did not just prevent the breach, but also made sure that the ambassador stayed within the parameters of the protocol behavior. The ambassador confirmed my granddad's accomplishment by saying, "Oh, tight security you have here." Celeste herself smiled and responded, "Indeed, sometimes their dedication amazes even me." As she nodded at the guest, he remembered to follow the protocol prescribed to guests at the reception. With a bow and a backward walk, he removed himself from her visage. My granddad retracted the weapon and stepped back to his post. The day was saved, and he was the hero responsible for it. I considered myself lucky to be in a family of heroes. The showcase tome in my quarters that my grandfather had written about the event was the only testimony to his truly heroic deed. It had also been the means to my betterment. I had often read it when I was off duty and knew it by heart, despite its thickness. Every muscle fiber that was involved and every thought he had during the incident in the making had been eternalized in his writings. The situation I was in was very similar to what Granddad had faced. I might be a hero yet. The ambassador I was suspicious about was approaching Celeste. His eyes were facing the floor, implying non-invasive intentions. He seemed to know his protocol, but that just meant I had to observe him with extra focus. I needed to spot minor details in his body language to determine his future actions that could result in breaching the protocol. For all I knew, he could have just been pretending to follow the ceremonial behavior, while planning the sudden action outside of the predicted parameters. He bowed. I exhaled the breath I was holding. The ordeal was not yet concluded, though. The situation could still spin out of control at any point. I kept my body strung, in case immediate action was necessary. He lifted up his head and retracted himself from the queue. My body muscles relaxed for a moment before the next guest in line approached. I filled my lungs with air again. Having previously brushed up on my knowledge of profile analysis charts about Mayor, I felt more at ease. She was a regular guest and knew the protocol well. I had witnessed her performance firsthand many times before, and it had been superb. Adjusting my strategy, I focused more on the external factors, while confirming her execution of my predicted mental simulation of her movements. I was ready to switch my focus at her slightest deviation from following the protocol. This tactic would allow me to recreate the heroism of my father, if an opportunity for it would present itself. His book about the deed he had performed was even thicker than my grandfather's memoir. Not just by following the tactic his father, my grandpa, had taught him, but by improving on them. He didn't just manage to defuse a tense situation, he prevented it entirely. Celeste held a tea party for her friends, and my father was serving as one of her guards at the time. It was viewed as a low priority guarding duty, as the amount of threats in Celeste's living quarters was considered to be limited. The lack of visible dangers presented an even greater opportunity, as there was no need for elite guards to be present. It meant less competition for ascension to the hero status. There were even some guards posted that didn't come from any lineage of royal guards. A pitiful competition to a stallion of my father's caliber. Nonetheless, the regiment of guards consisted of fairly observant individuals, as my father concluded with a thorough observation of their eye movement tactics. The bulk of them were stationed at the walls of the room. My father was assigned to the door area. The responsibility was weighing heavily on him, as most potential dangers would originate from the corridor to which the door was connected. With diligent training, my father had surpassed even my grandpa's detection skills. He was able to mentally follow the medium-range conversation that Celeste was indulging in order to simulate any potential followed-up interactions between Celeste and her friends. At the same time, he managed to capture the remaining sounds and process them on a separate mental scape. This learned ability allowed him to follow two separate discussions at the same time. He adapted his technique to parallel process background noise. As my father followed Celeste's personal conversation, he managed to detect disturbance in the sound matrix, an uninvited presence in the detectable surrounding parameter. Claws were tapping on the floor in the corridor, drawing near. He looked at the source of the sound deviation and saw the cat wandering the corridor outside of the room. Had the room been secured with the door closed, the potential for this tense situation could have been avoided, but Celeste had decided that the air in the room was a bit musty. To counter the effects of stale breathing air, she had opened the window and the door for an increased atmospheric gas circulation to occur within the enclosure. The cat peeked in the room. My father accounted for all the objects in the cat's view and estimated the predicted cat's motivational tendencies for each one of them. The cave presented the highest external motivational hazard. It wasn't just the cat's unhindered field of view that compromised the sanctity of the inner perimeter. The draft from an open window blew in the direction toward the cat. It was logical to assume that the cat not only saw the cake, but could also smell it. That had the potential of triggering primal animal instincts, increasing its motivation for the breach. As the cat stepped forward, my dad placed his weapon in front of its path. His action successfully demotivated the cat, which turned around and continued its stroll along the corridor. Celeste's monologue was undisturbed by the potential formation of a tense situation. Nobody, except for fellow guards, even noticed my father's heroism. He not only detensified the situation, he prevented the tensification itself. It was his mastery of the multi-focus technique that allowed him that. I too had learned this technique. It had taken me more than a decade to master it, but it was worth it. The internalization of it had prepared me for multiple potential threat environments that I was often exposed to in the line of duty. I was already older than my father had been at his act of heroism. He hadn't mentioned anything directly to me, but I knew he had been wondering whether or not I was a failure. The prospect of not living up to my father's expectations had been eating me inside for some time now. I had been a royal guard since I came of age, yet I had no heroics to show for it. During the past few years I have stepped up my game, and unbeknownst to my father, I had been training myself in secret not just with 2 streams of dripping water, but 3. I could usually count the number of droplets from all 3 sound channels simultaneously. However, I had not yet fully mastered this detection technique. It worked most of the time, but as the sounds of droplets overlapped, I had to use extra focus to separate the sounds. In rare instances, my focus levels dropped below those that were needed for my definite result production processes. Airing my mental concentration direction away from the threesome enumeration task had, on occasions, caused me to lose count on one of the streams. It would probably take me a few more years of training before I'd fully master the 3 sound channels focus technique. There were many conversations taking place at the sides of the reception hall. However, they were too distant for me to make out with my lip reading technique, yet alone use my unreliable multi-channel eavesdropping ability. The theoretical impossibility of detecting the far layer of information conglomerate pleased me, as its undetectability pushed it out of my jurisdiction, freeing me of the obligation to react to any unknowable ill effects. What was out of my reach was also out of my accountability. Mare retracted from the queue. Adrenaline rushed through my veins as I mentally prepared for the greatest challenge of the day. Just then, Princess Luna entered the reception hall, intensifying the complexity of the already dire situation. An extra variable to accompany an already random subsystem of a pony that was Pinkie Pie. Many factors, simulation hindering states, multi-motivational overlappings. This situation wasn't just on the daily maximum scale. It had the potential of escalating into the most hazardous position I would be exposed to in both my past and future time scale. I scanned my factographic memory for a resembling protocol complacency reports from the last 10 years. I found no match. Current state of affairs was uncommon in nature. I overcharged my brain activity to prepare for the overwhelming challenge in the making. Discarding my previous simulation tree, I erected new branches of potential events that took new developments into account. Pinkie Pie stepped forward. She had only recently gotten involved with the affairs in the castle, and I didn't have any profile on her from my dad or granddad. I had to rely on my own research on her, which was sketchy at best. Pinkie Diane Pie was a loose cannon. She was the most unpredictable pony I had ever come across. She waved her hooves at Celeste, displaying her complete disregard for the protocol. Celeste did not return the look nor a gesture of her spatial positioning recognition and confirmation. I formed the assumption, with great probability attached to it, that the reason for her dismissal was a serious expression on approaching Luna's face. It consumed all of the focus of the Sun Princess. Her mirror neurons must have kicked in, as was deducible from the wrinkling of her forehead and tightening of her jaw muscles. The Night Princess stepped in front of Pinkie Pie and started whispering in Celeste's ear. She was obstructing my view of Pinkie Pie with her plot. My already multi-branched simulations were even further hindered by this withholding of relevant information. I had to make do with the scarce remains of my visual data stream and indirect glimpses of Pinkie's true state of external being. I formed an extra mind channel where I created a multitude of possible actions from Pinkie Pie in the obstructed field of view. From beyond Luna's flank rose Pinkie Pie's head. Her eyes were facing the ceiling with no object of interest present in the direction of her gaze. That indicated, with high probability, the expression of boredom. My mental red flags were raised. According to my scarce data I've managed to gather on Pinkie Pie, her amount of boredom correlated with her internal random action generation algorithms. At that point, all my simulations were rendered useless to the actual situation due to high amounts of improbability for every one of my mentally formed branches. I prepared for a usage of my last resort tactic. Even though I could not predict future actions with high amount of certainty, keen observation with charged reflexes would allow me to prevent the end points of tense factions in motion. If I was only observant and fast enough. Luna lifted her tail and tightened her muscles as she whispered in Celeste's ear with even more vigor. I gathered extra relevant visual data from between her legs that partially raised my facilities. Provided glimpses offered me a larger set of data I could work with. Through the now less hindering obstacle that Luna's shape presented in my field of view, I observed Pinkie Pie's muscle structure straining movements. I deduced that shifting of her weight to her hind legs was commencing. The potential for intensification of the situation increased, as her loose front appendages would present the whole array of additional possible threats. I had to prioritize calculations in my mind, as I couldn't keep up with processing all of them anymore. Pinkie Pie lifted herself on her hind legs. She was holding an object in her forehooves. An object I had not accounted for. It was a flattened balloon. She put the tip of it into her mouth, wrapping around the slit shaft with her lips, while holding it in the horizontal position with her forehooves. The unwarranted object grew bigger as she blew air into it. If she were to lose it from her forehooves, the pattern of its flight would be too hard to predict in advance. I wasn't sure if my reflexes were honed enough to deal with a threat of such magnitude. The balloon had already exceeded the recommended volume, yet she blew one more time into it. With her lips, she prevented air from rushing out and launching the balloon in an unpredictable trajectory. My only solace was knowing that she was a certified party pony, which meant she was probably trained in blowing. I had no data on her balloon inflation success rate, though. I was really hating myself for lacking that vital information at that point. I should have done more research on her at the times I was off duty. She let go of the balloon with her paws. I intensified my muscles strain and leaned my body slightly forward. Holding the balloon only with her mouth, she reached with her forehooves into an area that was located in my blocked field of view, formed by the static Luna's body outline. My tensed muscles started to hurt, but I persisted, redirecting my attention away from the mass inflow of distracting self-sensory data to the task at hooves. She raised her forelegs again and revealed a piece of rope on her paws. I deduced it was time for the most delicate phase of the process. She started wrapping the rope in front of her mouth at the base of the shaft. The tremors that her tying of the rope was causing could surpass the friction force against her moist lips, ripping the balloon from her mouth at any time. I couldn't form a prediction for the most probable end result. There was too much randomness involved in the balloon's possible flying path. I had to assume all viable trajectories. The worst-case scenario of the balloon hitting against some pony was a real possibility. The array of potential tense situations was off the scale. She pressed the two end pieces of rope between her hooves and extended her forelegs, tightening the rope that was wrapped around the glowing part of the balloon. The action of opening of her mouth was bound to happen eventually. As such an event would be taking place, there was an above-zero possibility of the rope not being properly tied into an adequate knot. The risk of the balloon not holding the pressure within its bounds was being increased by an ever-present potential of negligence and malpractice of the pony that relied more on intuition than protocol. Luckily, the rope seemed sufficiently tied, as the balloon assumed no velocity by its own accord. She banked the balloon from the bottom with her forehooves, then dropped down on all four legs. The balloon flew up, decelerating as it approached its simulated maximum high point that I had pre-calculated in my mind as soon as I had gathered all the relevant variables. She looked at Luna, who was still whispering into Celeste's ear. I had no information on Pinkie Pie's dynamic simulation capabilities of the unobserved surrounding environment. The chance existed that she wasn't trained in this technique and could not account for the balloon's descent in time. If that was the case and her eyes stayed disconnected with the looming threat of the balloon, the situation transcended her capabilities of containing it. Her eyes moved upward to an angle that should allow her detection of the falling balloon. I was drawing that conclusion based on the assumption that her focus levels weren't hindered and that her mental processes were at least partially focalized on her peripheral visual data stream. With a normal pony, I could be sure that would be the case, but this was Pinkie Pie. Nothing was deterministic when it came to her. Lifting her head, she bounced the balloon back up into the air. This time, however, the trajectory of it wasn't as vertical as before. She yawned, which caused her to close her eyes. It was a big yawn, and with her mouth still opening wider it appeared that she wasn't even halfway through it, yet the balloon was already descending from its maximum elevation point. The trajectory of the balloon coincided not just with Luna's personal space perimeter, but her bodily area itself. It was clear that Pinkie Pie had lost control of her balloon. My perceived time slowed down as a burst of thoughts rushed through my mind. Luna's body would remain still with high amount of probability, as her focus was still on Celeste. The balloon was out of her view and Princess Luna wasn't likely to erect any defense against it. I was the closest guard to the action. It was up to me to save the day. Without my intervention the impact of the balloon on her plot was unavoidable. This was my chance to shine, the chance to finally prove my worth. However, I had to act fast, as the contact was imminent. I crouched down, charged ahead with my full acceleration, thrusting my spear forward with definite precision. Sliding on the floor, I placed my weapon down the balloon's path just before it hit Luna's behind. The balloon hit the tip of my blade and popped. The sound of an explosion echoed through the hall. I tensed up as I retracted my weapon. No! Luna lifted herself up on her hind legs. Her mane and tail spread out as she galloped with her forehooves in the air. Please don't send me to the moon again. I promise I'm not evil anymore. Celeste rolled her eyes and shook her head. Luna dropped back on her forelegs. She lifted her right hoof and placed it on her muzzle, looking left and right at the ponies around her. My balloon. Pinkie Pie grumbled. Luna's gaze lingered on me as her eyelids half closed. I slid back to my guarding position. My teeth were clenched. I have not prevented the tense situation. I had, in fact, intensified it beyond the worst-case scenario limits. I was an evildoer. It is okay, everypony. Luna lifted up her foreleg. When the balloon popped it startled me a bit, and I overreacted. That is all. There is nothing an pony should be concerned about. She looked at the crowd. Most of the ponies had their eyebrows lifted. As Luna put down her hooves on the floor, ponies began talking to each other, not focusing on her anymore. I heard a set of hoof steps in the corridor behind me. 2 ponies were approaching. Shining armor and a fellow guard came into my view. My superior waved me with his hoof. I was being replaced in order to lax the situation I had caused to intensify. As I walked to the lieutenant, the guard assumed my post. "You blew it," Shining armor whispered to me. My emotional barriers crumbled. "I'm a disgrace to the Royal Guard, sir." Tears started to form in the corners of my eyes. "I have no excuses for my failure, sir." My voice crackled. Serving the Empire can be stressful at times. Some ponies just aren't grounded enough to perform the rigorous tasks that we assign to them. If it stresses you out too much, then perhaps being a Royal Guard just isn't for you. Have you considered that? I gasped. He was right. One has to have certain capabilities in order to serve the Royal Guard. Only by adequate performance can one bear the full weight of the responsibility of fulfilling the assigned tasks. My performance today was definitely not satisfactory. There was no denying that I failed the Empire. Herding ponies was, without a question, not in my job description, yet that's exactly what I did. There was only one conclusion that I could draw from it all. I'm just not good enough.